Hey everybody, my name's Alex, and this is Bento Radio. Now, before we jump into what we're talking about this week, I just wanted to do the normal opening show podcast stuff and say, if you really like the show, be sure to subscribe to it wherever you get it, whether that be here on YouTube or whether that be your favorite podcast app of choice. You can subscribe to me wherever you're seeing me or hearing me, which are YouTube and, once again, your favorite podcast app. But in addition to that, I would love it if you gave the podcast 5 stars. If the place you're taking it in allows, that really helps the show. And be sure to share the show with friends you might think like it, all that kind of stuff. But on that note, if you absolutely can't get enough of the show, you can hop on over to bento-box.ghost.io, and there is entries for a bunch of different episodes of the show. I've fallen behind a little bit. I'm trying to catch up and keep up. There's also some articles I've written over there. The last thing, though, that is over there is a link to the beta version of the app I'm using that I've been developing for a while now. And that app is essentially a watch list app plus more. And what I mean by that is that I'm sure a lot of people watching this or listening to this, I like to track what I'm watching, but I don't, and I'm sure it is extremely useful. I don't super have a use anymore, especially as somebody who thinks about anime and entertainment and media for something that's just a checklist. And I'm not saying that that's not a useful thing, or that if you use My Anime List or Kitsu or AniList for any of those things, that's bad. And you can also use the app I'm developing, which is called Bento Watch, for that same thing. But Bento Watch's goal is to help you think more critically about what you're watching and keep concentrated notes on what you're watching. So instead of having a big notes file in your phone, if you're using an iPhone or an Android phone of some kind, you can keep it all, actually only if you're using an iPhone, because this is only in development for iOS, because I'm only one human. I don't have a viable Android device to develop to, or I would attempt it probably. But the idea is that you can take notes on almost every aspect of the show. So that means episode level notes for anything you're watching. There's a generalized series spanning notes section at the top. You can even do things like track your rewatches. You can do things like the whole Discover page. We can search for just about any anime you can think of. That includes one of my favorite things, a random section, because when I was building this, I thought it would be great to give people a way to just find random stuff you would never find. And you can find stuff that you love, you can find stuff that you hate. Every once in a while, the random section will suggest something to me, and it's a one episode thing, and that one episode is 20 minutes because it was a promotional video done for a Freshness Burger, which is a real name of a real burger chain in Tokyo. I'm not kidding. In 2012. So if that at all interests you, go check it out at the website. That website again is bento-box.ghost.io. Now, without further ado, let's jump into what we're talking about this time, and that is a little show that just wrapped up its current season, and that is the 3rd season of Jujutsu Kaisen. So I'm going to toss it over to Ai to give us a plot synopsis for the 3rd season. Take it away, Ai.
Jujutsu Kaisen Season 3 plunges directly into the Culling Game, a deadly, large-scale battle orchestrated by Kenjaku that forces sorcerers and newly awakened fighters into isolated colonies across Japan. Participants must earn points by defeating others, creating a brutal system where survival depends on both strength and strategy. Yuji Itadori and his allies split up to navigate the chaos, aiming to save Megumi Fushiguro's sister and gain enough control over the game's rules to stop it from within. Along the way, they encounter powerful new enemies, including ancient sorcerers with overwhelming abilities, while familiar faces like Yuta Okotsu return to the battlefield. As the stakes escalate, the story shifts from structured missions to a relentless fight for survival, pushing every character to their limits and forcing them to confront the true cost of power, choice, and responsibility. Now
that the plot synopsis out of the way, I want to attack this from 2 angles here. Because I think that the third season of JJK, that first they're JJK as a whole. The third season is so deep into it that it's not hiding the bag anymore. You're having a conversation with Gege Akutami about a bunch of different things that he sees in the world around him. And then there's also the artistry and artistic quality of just the third season of JJK, which is a much different thing than the previous two seasons. On a whole other level, I would argue. And I guess that's where we'll start here. Because the thing that JJK Season 3 is doing is so much different than anything in its class right now. It's doing what I wish a lot more stuff did once it knew it had popularity. And it occurred to me when I watched the first episode of Season 3, MAPPA isn't making episodes of this thing anymore. They're making the freeform jazz of shonen anime. If that makes any sense. Back to the story, but it winds and twists, and I understand that some of this is probably Akutami's writing style in the original manga, but there's a much more straightforward, much less artistic, much less expressive way to make this show that MAPPA is just choosing not to do. And what's interesting about that is it's been pretty divisive. I think it's the third episode of Season 3. The numbering on Crunchyroll is diabolical for this, because they, as far as I can tell, haven't stopped continuous numbering since Season 1, so it's really hard to delineate the seasons if you're just looking at the episode numbers. It's not like Season 3, Episode 2 or whatever. It's like Season 1, Episode 56 or some insane nonsense, which that kind of stuff always drives me nuts because it's harder to keep track of where you are. But that's neither here nor there with this. But this season has been so much more referential to American cinema and cinema in general, and it has much more of an artistic quality. The best way I can describe it is it's almost like JJK through the stylistic lens of Chainsaw Man. And what I mean there is Chainsaw Man has tons of movie references baked into it because I forget the name of the insane former lawyer who makes Chainsaw Man. But that's part of his deal. So when they went to make Chainsaw Man, they put that stuff into the show. And that show is wildly experimental and wildly ambitious in its experiment, in the way that it's experimental, down to the fact that every single episode has a different ending sequence and song, which means that they didn't take the route lots of people take, which is, we're going to make an opening sequence and an ending sequence, and we're just going to stick with that all the way through. And in JJK, while they do have an ending sequence, it's this incredibly beautiful, impressionistic, painterly thing. And their opening sequence is absolutely exceptional. From the opening song, which is Aizo, which translates to love and hate, roughly in English, not American, but English, and just the visuals, the way everything's put together. It's this incredibly fun, kind of spoiler-free celebration of the season itself. It has this very Anijam feel, which is, in my mind, what a good anime opening should always feel like, which is, if you don't know what an Anijam is, a animator exercise in which each animator gets a certain, it can be as small as one drawing sometimes, but each animator gets a number of animation cells to do something, and they pass it on to the next animator. This is a common thing to do in animation classes in college courses because it helps with your adaptability, it helps with your creativity. It's like tons and tons and tons of fun. But to me, really good opening sequences for anime have that kind of Anijam. They feel like, oh, this person got this cut. And the pace is set by the first cut, and all the way through, everybody's adapting to what came before, so everything necessarily feels like it's a part of a whole, because unless you are setting the pace with the first cut, you have to adapt to what came before you. And Aizo, the opening sequence for Season 3, has that vibe to it in a really fun and kinetic way. And song Izo has been stuck in my head since I first heard it. It's like so celebratory and fun and full of energy, just like the actual opening it accompanies. And then we get to the main story, and to the main part of the show, each episode. And in each episode, MAPPA making art house animated shorts in many ways. Yes, stuff happens, and you get from point A to point B to all the way to point Z in the show, but you don't. It's clear they've changed the way they're working, so they're not taxing their animator quite as hard, because in season 2, you saw things like the Maharaga fight, and you've heard all these horrible stories about animators saying they want to die, for lack of a better term, on social media, and people being really difficult about it because people are jerks. Even if they like the product of art, they don't necessarily like the artist. They just want the product, and it's like that's a consumerist, shitty way to behave towards any artistic endeavor. Anime, film, any kind of entertainment is also an artistic endeavor on some level. And to want the product more than you want the person who made the product to be happy and healthy and creatively fulfilled and capable of creating more after the fact misses the whole point on some level in a way that will always really frustrate me. But it's clear that they've cleaned up their creative process. They've figured out ways to be less, to grind people into dust less. And what you're getting in season 3 is you're getting what people were hoping for out of the Maharaga fight when it originally aired. I understand that it was cleaned up for the Blu-ray release, which is a rare, recent version of that went wide. But here, it's all on the page, and it rules. I just finished the last episode of the season, the spoilers, Yuta Okotsu 3-way fight episode, and just the energy, the way they did the late Izo drop, the framing and the creativity around the curse techniques and all this other stuff was so kind of frenetic and fun that it was fun to watch that fight. It was fun to watch essentially an episode that's just a big fight. And so many of the episodes you're watching in this are just big fights, but they are done with such artistic flair and a devote to how do we make this really interesting and weird and cool. And it helps that they have Gege Akutami's source material to go from, and I'll get to him in a second. But it's just a fun time. It's from the Maki episode, where Maki basically does kill the entire Zenin clan because they kill her sister. And they treat it like the Crazy 88 fight in the tea house in which, by the way, I've been to the restaurant in Pungi that is the inspiration point for that whole set and in many ways that whole fight. And it's just, when you're in that restaurant, you can see this is the Kill Bill restaurant. Not because they have anything up there, anywhere denoting it. You just get the same sense of, levels and, space works in a very similar way. It's very clear that there's a line, even if it isn't exactly straight, from that restaurant to the tea house for Kill Bill, and therefore the framing of that whole Crazy 88 fight, which you can go look up on YouTube, I'm sure, if you want to see what I'm talking about, and you haven't seen Kill Bill Volume 1? Yeah, I think it's Kill Bill Volume 1. No, it's Kill Bill Volume 1. Then it kind of comes into this because they make a thing that is so clearly referential to that sequence that people, when it first aired, were pulling stills of Maki and stills of Uma Thurman and just put together and being these are just the same thing. Which I love to see it. I've brought up this idea a lot on this show. Good artists borrow, great artists steal. And this is what that means. This is art referencing other entertainment. Creative referencing each other from across the way and making eye contact and being I see you. And the whole show is like that. The whole show has this art house feel that you don't get from a lot of shows. And as soon as I say that, people are going to say, well, Alex, what about Freya? And Alex, what about Witch Hat Atelier this season? Or a number of other shows. The thing you need to understand is those shows are the outlier. The reason why they are recognized as being so good is because they are so head and shoulders above the rest of the pile. And in many cases, their stories lend them more to that. Frame-It is a beautiful show, but Frame-It is also a beautiful story that lends itself to this kind of calm, contemplative, slice of life, incredibly detailed, we're going to animate the shit out of this, turning the page of this book kind of thing. JJK, whether you like it or not, whether you like the story more or not, sits in the same place as something like Naruto. Which means it sits in the same place as something... I watched a couple episodes of this. I'm not sure I can take it to watch the whole thing. But it all sits in the same kind of place as something like a show called Dead Account. From a genre perspective, Dead Account is essentially JJK with cell phones, more or less. And you look at Dead Account and you're like, oh, the main character is clearly like Yuji. The girl is clearly like Nobara. The support character is clearly like Fushiguro. But the thing that you should realize when you watch JJK is Yuji is Naruto, Fushiguro is Sasuke, Nobara is Sakura, and Gojo is Kakashi. And not a big, oh my god, no one's ever done this before. Hell, Naruto is a lot of recycling from other things, notably things like Hunter. And if you watch something like Naruto Holds Up JJK, you see reflections of that in it. If you watch something like Hunter x Hunter and JJK and you hold them next to each other, you see at best echoes in different parts of different characters that somehow got to be characters like Fushiguro or Itadori or Nobara even. You can see a lot of biscuit in Nobara. And I haven't gotten in trouble, but people have tried to jump down my throat for saying that I think that Nobara is a well-written character. And here's the thing. I think, with the exception of some bit female characters in this show has such a better grasp on female characters than much of shonen battle anime writ large has. It's writing female characters who feel fuller and more formed and more fleshed out than very often you get out of certainly something like Naruto. If you don't know anything about Kishimoto's goal with Sakura, is Kishimoto wanted to write a female character that fans would absolutely adore and love to death. And what he ended up doing is making this lovesick, hot-headed, slightly asshole character that everybody has just written off as ultimately wrote off as useless because he just didn't balance her correctly. And looking at a character like Nobara, I think if there was a goal in Gege Akutami's head, and I'm not trying to foresee exactly what he was trying to do, it's that he wanted to make a character that didn't need to be validated by the male characters in the show. And I believe he talked about the fact that he looped with Nobara and made her one of the stronger characters in the show. It's part of the reason why he takes her off the board for a while, because she is... Every once in a while, I'll go back to the first season and I'll watch the very last episode of the first season, because the synergy between Nobara and Yuji in that, and the downright dirty deeds done dirt cheap viciousness of Nobara in that last fight is so ruthless and incredible in a way that most people are afraid to allow a female character they're writing to do, because they're very often worried about what Kishimoto was worried about, in that you like the characters. And I think the secret sauce of JJK is that you're not supposed to like any of the characters, maybe with the exception of Yuji. Because the thing with JJK, and I've said this every time I've talked about JJK, either to friends or to you, the audience, the point of JJK is that it's a power system that revolves around people being just bad people. You know, Fushiguro, it's not... Is he an awful person? Is he irredeemable? No, but he's not a good person. Toji, one of the powerhouses of this show, and Fushiguro's father, It's just a rotten motherfucker. He just is. It's just the way he is. It's built into him. Nobara, again, gives this great speech in the second part of season 2, in that, screw your ideas of femininity. I love myself when I'm ugly as shit. I love myself when I'm beautiful as shit. It doesn't matter. If you look at all of the female characters, from Mei to, I forget the girl with the scar across her face's name, to even the lesser female characters, they're all rotten a little bit. And all the male characters, in a way, are rotten and have imperfections and are uniquely human, because by building a power system, and I guess we're into the second part where I'm talking about the story as a whole and what I think Gay is doing here, he's building characters who have the capacity to be bad people, but still have heart. Okotsu, in the very last episode of this season, said, I won't let Gojo have to kill his best friend twice. I'm going to be the one who kills Kenjaku. I'm going to be the one who snuffs this motherfucker out. But he is also a guy who so severely, even if accidentally, cursed his childhood love interest that when she died, she became a cursed spirit who is forever tied to him in a deeply, violently affectionate, over-affectionate way. You have Maki, who goes back home and kills her entire family. Granted, not without cause, but fully just, nope, we're done here. You guys are all assholes. I feel no remorse about just cutting the bloodline off at the knees here, because this should not be. You see characters like, what's his name? One everybody hates, who's got the lotus hair, who claps. There's too many characters for me to keep all their names straight at this point. But my point is that he set up a universe in which being a bad person pays off and being inherently selfish pays off. And that lets him play with more questionable and less idealized character traits, because he's not worried about you liking the characters. He had confidence that you'll spend enough time with the characters to grow to like them and maybe even understand them. And you see this paying off in this season of the show, because he's in the manga and therefore the anime, the story has done the work of being, trust us. We know what we're doing. We're going to show you characters who are bad people, but we're going to give you the context for why and how they got there. And you're not going to dismiss somebody like Toji, but you're going to understand it. And that's going to give you the space to continue to like the show, even if you don't like the characters. I've talked about this 900 times on this show, but everybody busts up against Jobless Reincarnation because they don't like Rudius. And a bad attempt at waving that away. The point isn't that you should like Rudius. The point is that Rudius is a bad person. No, the point is that Rudius never got to be a good person. He was never given the space to be a good person. A lot of people's complaints about Naruto is that Naruto tried to convince you that it's a show about working hard and being rewarded for it, when in reality it ends up being a show about preordained destiny. Naruto is the son of the ninja president, given a special power that only 9 other people in the world have. And the way that they set it up, it makes you feel like hard work and grit is what you need, is what you get to succeed. But if you look at the characters who actually need to do that, aka Rock Lee, they don't go as far as Naruto, who has everything in his corner to get to where he goes. One of those things I think is really interesting about Yuji is that Yuji has that, but until his past essentially reached out and pulled him to where it wanted him to be, and this is true also of Yuta as a character, he was just trying to live his life. Yuta was just trying to be a normal teenager. And in his brain, he's like, I'm super athletic, but that's just the person I am. There's not a reason for that. Later on down the line, you learn that Yuji was built for housing Sukuna. And I don't know if this has come up again in the actual... I don't think this has come up in the... Well, actually it has. It came up in episode 2 or something. But he's been built by Kenjaku to be the thing that he now is. But that wasn't his choice. And so in that, Gege Akutami is having a conversation about parents' best laid plans for their children, which is a very common thing in not just Japanese culture, but East Asian culture and also all cultures. In every culture, there's a version of a parent who wants their kid to be a certain thing in a certain way and lays out their life in front of them and says, I'm giving you this path forward, take it. And instead of celebrating that the way that Kishimoto does with Naruto, Gege Akutami says, this isn't this kid's fault. None of what's happening to this kid is his fault. And you see that most inside of another conversation that Gege Akutami clearly wants to have with Japan, but the world in general, because at this point he knows that his thing is being published internationally, and that is with Higuruma. And Higuruma is a Japanese defense attorney. And if you watch the first episode of where you see Higuruma, and you saw the stat where they said Japanese criminal court had a 99.9% conviction rate, and you thought that was insane, it's not. That's pretty accurate to this day. Because Japanese courts work, I believe Japanese courts, you're considered guilty until proven innocent, and they have all kinds of insane things they do to coerce confessions and to make sure that if they are trying a case, the prosecutors will get the conviction. And the thing you see in Higuruma is somebody who's trying to find justice in that incredibly unfair system, who just fully snaps and creates what he believes is a better version that is purely evidence-based, and it uses nothing other than the pure evidence and the arguments between one party and between the defending party and the accusing party to determine a punishment. And where that falls apart for him is when he encounters Yuji, and Yuji says, I killed all those people in Shibuya. That's my fault. And that's when the show and Higuruma say, that wasn't your fault. And like you, as a viewer, it's made very clear for you that it wasn't his fault, he wasn't in control of his own body. But the show wants to tell you that out loud. It wants to vocalize that to Yuji, who's carrying around all of this guilt about it happening. And he feels the way a lot of people would feel, probably, in that he feels like he should be in control of that. And I want to talk about a thing I talked about a bunch of weeks ago when I talked about, actually a couple months ago I think now, when I talked about Gachiakuda. And that is the fact that Shonen anime has changed. It is no longer, and it's changed because the world around it has changed. It is very much no longer the era of Naruto, the era of Dragon Ball Z, even the era of Bleach. Those shows have a hopeful core of do the right thing, and justice will prevail, and it will all be okay. Shows like Kaiju Number 8, shows like JJK, and Kaiju Number 8 is actually probably the best, for me, the best example of this, are contending with a world that is starting to mess with the core demographic of these shows in ways that wasn't happening in the heyday of Dragon Ball Z, in the heyday of Naruto or Bleach. The way Yuji acts about the Shibuya incident happening to him, because he was essentially a passenger in his own body for a large portion of that, is mirrored, I think, the way that a lot of kids, especially young men, can be made to feel by watching the Manosphere people. Because the Manosphere people will tell you that you are the center of your own universe, you can actualize anything, and all of this, like, rah-rah, and what they're doing is they're trying to activate the viewer so they can sell stuff to them. They're trying to distance the viewer from what their reality may be and get them on a permanent self-improvement ladder where they can be manipulable to part with their money. It's all they're trying to do. And in doing that, they say, if something doesn't go your way, that's somehow your fault. And then what their next thing will be is, I can give this way for you to make that go your way. When you don't get a job from a job interview, it's just because it wasn't right for you. It's just because, like, a bird pooped on your suit when you were walking to the interview. All these different things, they're out of people's control, and so much of what people are trying to sell other people is a sense of control. And in not just Yuji, but Higuruma, you have this conversation about a character who thinks he should have been able to take control, and a character who did in the form of Higuruma. And Higuruma just says, I'm operating in an unfair system, so I've created what I believe to be the fairest version of justice. But then he encounters somebody who's become conditioned to think that something that couldn't have possibly been their fault was their fault. And he has the evidence that says, oh, he wasn't in control of his body, Sukuna was. And he negates his own judgment. He breaks his own rules because he finds a space where human understanding needs to enter the picture. If you look at the conviction rate stuff of Japan, so much of it feels like systemized justice that's facilitated by a unique kind of cruelty in the police force in general. And the police force of Japan is a very specific kind of bad, a very specific addition to the ACAB universe, in that they are the people who are pressuring. I think you can hold somebody for 23 days, and then you can release them and recharge them and hold them for another 23 days. I'm not super sure on the specific. Basically infinitely. So you can hold somebody with really no real reason forever. And you can do all kinds of coercion tactics and all this stuff that's allowed. But as soon as you hear it, you're like, oh, this is bad. This is just. Justice should not be made to operate with these parameters, because of course it's going to get abused. And Akutami's having a conversation about that. He, I said, has a conversation about family and family dynamics, and specifically best laid plans of parents for their children, and all this other stuff that feels really heavy. And like I said earlier, because he's working with characters that don't need to be good people 24/7. And that used to include Yuji until this season. You know, Yuji doesn't need to be a good person anymore. He treats himself like a cog, and he is almost rational to a fault actor for much of the show, for the episodes that he's in. And by making the Culling Games a thing that has a questionable you can do that with so many of the characters. Nobody chose to be here, but they're all just like, oh, we're stuck in these weird colonies, we need to figure this out, or we die. And everybody has suspicions behind why Kenjaku is doing it, because there has to be a reason he's doing it, other than his stated goal, which sounds awfully lofty and pointless. And I haven't kept up with the manga, so I'm not super clear on what that goal ultimately is. But based on Modello, which is the sequel manga to JJK that Geiya Akutami has been writing, it's clear that Akutami-sensei, as an author, wants to have some real conversations about some third rail topics. Does that make any sense? Or not even third rail topics, but things that everybody knows is going on, but nobody wants to say anything about. One of the other creative minds in anime and manga who does this, notably less successfully, with less of a hit rate, although this is Geiya Akutami's first big thing, so who knows what his hit rate will be. Although from what I understand, I haven't read Modello, but it's supposed to be very good. But it's also still in the JJK universe, is Soichiro Watanabe. So what everybody wants out of Soichiro Watanabe and what he gives people are two very different things. Everybody wants Cowboy Bebop and Space Dandy. What he keeps giving people is Terror in Residence and what's the thing on HBO about, essentially about the opioid crisis. And I forget the name of that show. In the thing from HBO, I'm going to put it on screen here. But in that show, in the episodes, he has different conversations about different parts of life in each episode. Down to the point of, he had a conversation about people worshipping AI as a god, which is a thing that still happens. And AI psychosis. He has obviously conversations about the pharmaceutical industry and the opioid crisis and the people who work and make those things, make those drugs. And then in Terror and Resonance, actually I skipped a show, but we'll get to it in a second. In Terror and Resonance, he is having a direct conversation with the right wing, with the political right of Japan. And he's also having a direct conversation with a post-9/11 world. And part of the reason why the thing feels so weird is because he doesn't handle either of those the best. If you know what you're looking at, it's pretty ham-handed and not great at hiding the ball just enough where you can... Either hiding the ball just enough where you can ignore it, or doing what JJK does, which is, no, here's the thing. If we're going to introduce you to Higuruma, we're going to tell you the deal with Higuruma. If we're going to in JJK, if they're going to introduce you to a character, they're going to tell you their deal, so you have context for what this character is, as an addition to the story, but also just as a thing in the world. And in the last show of Toshiro Watanabe's I want to bring up here is Carol and Tuesday, which you can go on Netflix and watch the entirety of it right now. I really like it. It's a ton of fun. But Carol and Tuesday is about music and the music industry. And it has a predictive quality now because it predicts the participation of AI in music that is undeniably true now. But it ultimately, with a character named Erdogan, in addition to Carol and Tuesday, comes back to celebrating singer-songwriters and people who pour their soul into their work, because if you're not familiar with the show, spoilers, I'll probably cover it in full somewhere at some point. But Erdogan is a big-time house DJ whose life and thus career just unravel over the course of the show. I mean, what the show does is it gives him as a character a side plot where he comes back into his own and reconnects with the kind of artist that he was when he started and makes better music than he's made in decades, even though he's incredibly popular. And it uses him to talk about both ends of the career trajectory of a musician. But what it also does, and I think this is pretty clever, is it doesn't deride people for using AI as a tool. And everybody who's using AI in the show, including, I forget the producer's name, knows that you can't just put you can't just put a vocal track on it and push it out the door. It needs to have some kind of human heart and human awareness. And it's a subtlety in the understanding of what the possibilities around AI could and should be that most people on both sides of the argument just haven't gotten to yet. And suffice it to say, Toshiro Watanabe is doing a lot, and has been doing a lot for a while, of the thing that Gege Akutami is trying to do with first JJK and now Modelo when in manga form, but for the purpose of this, JJK in anime form, is that he's trying to have a conversation about the world we live in and society and what it means to be built into a person who's supposed to do a certain thing and not want to. In the case of Yuji's purpose was predefined before he was born, but that's not what he wants. Fushiguro is connected to the Enin clan, but he wants nothing to do with them because they're a bunch of eugenistic assholes, basically. That's the normal, very Naruto-esque story of the younger generation having to rip apart everything that the older generation has put together because it's all starting to rot at the core and threatens to pull everything down with it. But the older generation has so much power, and that's a huge part of what the Zenin clan represents, that they don't want to let go because they fear that letting go will, and this sounds incredibly familiar if you live in America right now, they fear that letting go will actively hurt them permanently. And they don't care that when they die, they'll have left the world in the worst place. And so much about what JJK is about the current generation trying to fix the ills of the people who came before them who weren't any more or less selfish than the generation that as it stands now, but had less foresight at the beginning than the generation now is trying to have currently, because of current generation of Jujutsu sorcerers in JJK is living in a very messed up world that was caused by the people who came before. The fact that Kenjaku started the Culling Games, and Kenjaku is hundreds of years old, is not an accident. The fact that the Zenin clan was this massive, sprawling, decades-old, hundreds of years old family is not a mistake. The fact, in the very last episode, the two characters, the girl who can manipulate the sky itself and the dude with the pompadour, I forget their names, they talked to Yuta by referring to his last name, not by his first name. And this is a thing that's big in Japan, but not here, that you know somebody really well, you refer to them by their family name. But what that does is it strips... what that does practically, it has a quality of stripping individuality away from somebody. Because what you're telling somebody is like, and Kie hates when I call her by her last name. Because she's like, that's not what we do. Hey, I met you in America, and we met speaking English, so we should speak English. Kie has no interest in speaking Japanese to me. She has interest in hearing me speak Japanese because she thinks it's wild that I have an incredibly good accent. If you've ever listened to the podcast, the Japanese part up front, that's straight me fully speaking it into the microphone. I have a really good Japanese accent, and I know that. But she gets really upset when I refer to her last name, because we have basically always been so close that would never be, like, she has always been Kie, I've always been Alex. It's never been Kato-san, Hochikohan-kun. It has never been that. But what doing that in the way somebody's individuality, it says, you are not an individual until I know you well enough. Until then, we're going to use your family name, and you're going to represent the family in a really meaningful way. And in their fight, Yuta's treated like he's a member of this clan that he's had no access to for as long as he's been alive. Not really or meaningfully. And in JJK 0, the point of that movie is that Yuta didn't know what happened to him. He didn't know why he became this cursed child, essentially. And on a hunch, what Gojo does, he goes and he looks into it. And he goes, oh, the reason why all this happens is because you're like my third cousin twice removed. Basically, he's part of the same, of a bloodline that's connected to the Six Eyes bloodline that Gojo's from. And just, he was so far removed that nobody knew to keep track of it. And so, Yuta's deal is that he grew up until the thing with Rika happened, the accident with Rika happened that they show in the movie. As a normal kid going to elementary school, he has a mutual crush situation, and then tragedy strikes, and the circumstances of his birth take over. And so much of what this season is about is stopping that from happening to Yuji and to Fushigoro's sister and to all of these other characters constantly. And notably, by the end of the show, by the end of the final episode, Yuta doesn't kill anybody who's human. He kills the cursed spirit who's a cockroach because it's a giant cockroach that loves to murder. That can't be allowed to live, to run around free. But he doesn't kill the other two characters because he's like, it's not my place to kill you guys. Like, I'm not going to cut your weird reincarnation sabbatical short just because we need to deal with Kenjaku. You guys can be allowed to go and get a burger. As long as you give me your points, I don't care what happened. I don't care. I don't need to kill you. That's not, my goal isn't to be this eradication genesis clan of the Jujutsu world. My goal is to help my friends and get as many people out of this horse shit as possible. And I said that this comes from a different place than something like Naruto or Dragon Ball Z. And I started to talk about Kaiju number 8. And the reason why I think Kaiju number 8 is such a great example. Hey, I hope you enjoyed the podcast. And if you did, be sure to subscribe wherever wherever you're listening or watching. If you're listening to it on a podcast platform and they allow you to give a 5-star review, be sure to do that. If you're watching this on YouTube and you really liked what you saw, be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel and like the video. In addition, if you want to make sure that you don't miss a beat, be sure to hit that notification bell so you know when new episodes drop. But if you're wondering, they drop every Thursday night Eastern time. And on that note, if you really love the podcast and you really love what I'm trying to do here, be sure to give the website a look. That website is bento-box.ghost.io. There will be a link in the description of either this podcast or this video. It'll also be linked in the description of the entire podcast on the information page. It'll also be linked in the description of the YouTube channel. So there's plenty of ways for you to get to that website and check it out. If you want to follow me, my social links are also listed in the footer of that page. So once again, go over there to find that stuff. But I hope you like the episode. I look forward to talking to you next time. But until next time, I have been Alex. This has been Bento Radio, and I'll talk at you later.